Welcome to the deep dive. We don't do surface level here. We grab a single topic, the most important sources, and really dig into what you need to know. All this crafted specifically for you, the philosophical mind. Today, we're tackling hope. It might seem simple at first, right?
Yeah.
Wanting something good to happen.
That's
hope, yeah. But, anyone who enjoys thinking about ideas knows that sometimes the seemingly straightforward stuff is what leads to the most fascinating and complex discussions.
Absolutely. It's like you might think, hope, yeah, I get it, wishing for something good.
Yeah.
But then you start to think about it philosophically, and all these really fundamental questions pop up. Like, what does hope even tell us about how our minds work, what we actually value, how we deal with a future that's inherently uncertain?
Exactly. And to really get to the bottom of all this, we're going deep into a foundational text, something that's a bedrock of philosophical thought. We're talking about the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on hope. Think of it as the ultimate guide, centuries of debate distilled and ready for us to dissect. Our mission today is to unpack the rich history and the current philosophical landscape of hope. And we'll do it all while keeping in mind what makes it tick for a thinker like you.
Right.
Okay, so where do we even begin with this?
So I think it makes sense to start with just sort of the common understanding, right?
Yeah.
How do we typically think about hope? We connect it to wanting something, believing it has a chance of happening.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of basic intuition leads us to what philosophers often call the standard account of hope.
Standard account. Okay. What's the gist of that?
So basically, the standard account says that to hope for something, let's say, hoping P and P could be anything from I'll finish this incredible deep dive to we'll actually figure out climate change.
Mm-hmm.
It involves two main ingredients. First, desiring P, like really wanting it to be true. And second, believing that P is at least possible. Makes sense.
Right. Yeah, it sounds pretty straightforward on the surface. But I have a feeling things don't stay that simple for long when philosophers get involved. What are some of the problems with this standard account?
Right. You're onto something there. Philosophers always want to refine things. And they've pointed out some real issues. One of the earliest and most persistent is this thing called the despair objection. Imagine two people, both desperately want the same outcome. They both believe it's equally possible. The standard account says they should both have hope. But what if one of them just gives up?
Yeah.
Like falls into despair, even with the desire and belief in place. What explains that?
That's a great point. Just because I acknowledge something could happen doesn't mean I'm actively hoping for it.
Right.
There's a difference there. Like despair, even with the same ingredients, is missing that leaning in, that active engagement with the possibility.
Exactly. And that kind of leads to the substantial hope objection. It's like the standard account gets at a really basic, almost passive hope. But it doesn't quite grasp the kind of hope that drives us forward in the tough times. The hope that fuels action, makes you strive for something even when the odds are against you.
So if the standard account is missing something, where have philosophers gone looking for a more complete definition? Like, what are some of the additional elements they've tried to bring to the picture?
It's like building a more detailed model.
Right.
You need the basic framework, but then you add more layers. So you've got folks like Luc Bavins who said, mental imaging is key to hope, actually picturing the desired outcome. Andrew Chignall focused on the focus of attention. A hopeful person leans towards the possibility. Someone despairing focuses on its unlikelihood. So it's not just about a cold belief in possibility.
Makes sense. Imagining success that feels different from just saying, yeah, it could happen.
Right. Then there's Merov, who said, our attitude towards outside factors that could influence the outcome matters. If you see them as potentially helpful, you're more likely to hope. Philip Pettit talks about acting as if the outcome is probable, even if you're not totally convinced in your mind. And then you've got Calhoun with the phenomenological angle, how it feels to anticipate success. Success is part of your mental landscape.
Right.
Oh, and there's Haddock's incorporation thesis, where hope involves seeing your belief in possibility as a reason to do hopeful things, and your desire as a reason to actually take action.
That's quite a list of additions. I guess it shows just how hard it is to pin down what hope really is. But it also sounds like there's no agreement on which of these ingredients are absolutely essential.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And some folks argue that you can't break hope down into components at all. You have Gabriel Segal and Nathan Texter, for example, saying hope could be a primitive mental state. It's fundamental, not built from other stuff. And Marcus Gabriel, along with Tobias Bloser, argues that hope is an irreducible concept. We just get what it is, even if defining it perfectly is super hard, like trying to find consciousness. We all know what it is, but nailing down that perfect, universally agreed upon definition, that's a whole other challenge.
So the nature of hope itself, Is it a combo of other mental states or something more fundamental? Still under debate. But what about when it's rational to hope? That seems like another layer of complexity for a philosopher, right?
Oh, absolutely. There are both theoretical and practical dimensions to the rationality of hope. Theoretically, it's about whether the thing you're hoping for is actually possible in some real sense, and if you have reasons to believe it's possible. Does the evidence line up with your hope, or is it just wishful thinking? Then there's probability. Does it have to be likely for hope to be rational? Some say yes, hoping for the super improbable is just silly. Others say even a tiny chance can be enough for rational hope, depending on the context.
Right. It doesn't feel rational to hope I'll suddenly develop the ability to fly no matter how much I want it.
Right, exactly. But then there's the practical side. Is hoping useful? Does it help you achieve your goals? That's instrumental rationality. Or does hope have value in itself, even if what you're hoping for doesn't happen? That's intrinsic rationality. Bovens, for instance, says the mental imagery that comes with hope that can be pleasurable, can help you understand yourself better, even be part of experiences like love. So hoping itself might have worth beyond whether the thing you're hoping for comes true.
So even if hoping for something doesn't make it happen, the act of hoping can still be valuable. That's a subtle but important distinction. And I noticed in our outline that hope has also been considered a virtue.
Yes, that's another fascinating angle. Some philosophers see hope as not just a feeling or belief, but a character trait, a virtue you cultivate. Nicoletta Malona, for example, connects it to having the right priorities, valuing what's truly important. Marian Lamb sees it as a potential democratic virtue, encouraging working together, taking action for a better society. Nancy Snow even proposes hope as an intellectual virtue, being open to positive possibilities, which can then fuel your curiosity and discoveries. This shifts the focus from just the outcome to the kind of person who embodies hope.
So there might be a right way to hope, depending on the kind of person you're trying to be. And what about this idea of non-propositional hope? Hoping in someone or just a general sense of hopefulness not tied to a specific event.
Exactly. Not all hope is, I hope that this specific thing will happen. We can have hope in someone, trusting their abilities or character. Haddock calls this interpersonal hope. And then there's a kind of baseline hopefulness, a sense that something good is still possible, even when specific hopes have been dashed. Thinkers like Marcel, Bloch, Kant, Shade, Lear, and Gunther have all explored this idea of indeterminate, radical, or pre-intentional hope. It's like a feeling that good things might still be possible, even if we can't say exactly what those good things are right now.
So we go from very specific hopes to these broader ideas of hope as a virtue or even a fundamental outlook on the future. Seems like contemporary philosophy is really grappling with all the layers of this concept. But it's not just a modern idea, is it? Our outline mentions some pretty ancient roots.
It's definitely not. The history of hope in philosophy is super rich. And the ancient Greeks had some really interesting, often kind of conflicted views on elpis, their word for hope.
Conflicted. How so?
Well, on the one hand, there was a lot of suspicion around hope. It could be seen as a negative thing, something for people who lacked real knowledge or were prone to wishful thinking. There was this worry that hope would lead to disappointment and bad decisions because of these unrealistic expectations. Even someone like Solon, a very respected figure, warned against putting too much stock in empty hopes.
So hope was seen as potentially misleading, even dangerous.
Exactly. But on the other hand, they also recognized that hope was vital for getting through tough times. It was a way to motivate yourself to keep going when things were bad. Thucydides, for example, talked about both the downsides and the importance of hope in his writings on history. And then there's that really famous myth, Pandora's box. When all the evils were released, what was left inside? Hope.
Ah, Pandora's box, right. One of those stories that's been super influential in Western culture. And I think the outline mentioned different interpretations of why hope was left behind.
Exactly. Was it a gift? Something to comfort and motivate us after all the bad stuff was unleashed? Or was it just another evil, a trick that stops us from facing reality and doing the work we need to do in the present? This ambiguity in the Pandora myth, that's been something philosophers have come back to again and again, especially those dealing with existential questions.
Fascinating. So even at the very beginning of Western thought, hope was already a complex and debated idea. What about Plato and Aristotle, two of the biggest names in philosophy? What were their takes?
Well, Plato's view was a little mixed. In Timaeus, he kind of dismisses hope as a mindless advisor, putting it in the same category as confidence and fear, suggesting it makes us easily fooled. But in Philebus, he seems more positive, particularly when he talks about pleasures of anticipation, which he links to hope. He says these can even be rational if the anticipated pleasure is likely to be real. Plato also connects hope to our ability to act, suggesting that our efforts are often aimed at the future and therefore tied to hope in some way. And importantly, in dialogues like the Apology and Phaedo, he argues for the rationality of hope in an afterlife, especially one grounded in virtue.
So Plato saw a place for rational hope, especially when thinking about what might lie beyond our immediate experiences. What about Aristotle? How did he approach it?
Aristotle mainly discussed hope in relation to courage. He distinguished between types of hope that weren't truly courageous, like hoping for safety during a storm or recovery from illness, where the outcome depends more on luck than on you. That's not real courage. But he did see a link between hope and courage through confidence. A truly brave person, according to Aristotle, is also hopeful. It's that hopefulness that helps you be confident enough to act bravely when facing danger.
Interesting. So courage isn't just not being afraid, but having a hopeful disposition that boosts your confidence to act even when you are afraid.
Exactly. Aristotle also said hope is part of deliberation, the careful thinking we do when deciding how to act. We consider possible futures, and our hopes for those futures shape our choices. He saw hopefulness as good in young people, driving their ambition, and in the virtue of megalopsychia, which is often translated as greatness of soul or magnanimity. It's that hope that motivates us to go for noble, challenging goals. And scholars have also pointed out Aristotle's idea of hoping well, which means having a good understanding of past experiences and present realities to guide your hopes for the future.
So for Aristotle, hope that's grounded in reason and linked to virtuous action, that's a positive and important thing. But now the outline moves on to the Stoics, and I remember them being all about focusing on the present and accepting what you can't control.
You're right. The Stoics, especially someone like Seneca, didn't have a very favorable view of hope. Seneca actually linked hope very closely with fear. He said both come from focusing on the future and feeling uncertain and anxious. They were two sides of the same coin, keeping your mind in suspense instead of finding peace in the present. His idea was to avoid both hope and fear and focus on accepting what is and being virtuous right now.
Right, that fits in with the whole Stoic emphasis on accepting what's beyond your control and finding peace through reason and virtue in the moment. So in the ancient world, we see this back and forth, hope as potentially harmful and misleading versus hope as a necessary response to hardship and a motivator for action. And then things shift dramatically with the rise of Christianity.
Right, a big shift. In Christian thought, with major figures like Augustine and Aquinas, hope becomes central, something good, one of the three theological virtues, along with faith and love. It's a far cry from those earlier views that were much more skeptical of hope.
So what is it about the Christian understanding of hope that makes it so important?
For Christian philosophers, hope is fundamentally directed towards God and the promise of eternal life. It's the bridge between our present earthly existence and the future fulfillment of God's promises. Even in the writings of St. Paul, hope is crucial for believers. Paul says we can only truly hope for what's unseen and uncertain, and this hope comes from enduring suffering with faith, trusting in God's grace. He contrasts this future-oriented hope with relying on strict laws, and uses the example of Abraham, hoping against hope, trusting God's promise, even when everything around him seems to contradict it.
Hoping against hope, that phrase really captures a different kind of trust, going beyond just what seems probable.
Exactly. Augustine, in his Enchiridion on Faith, Hope, and Love, gives us a really clear analysis of hope. He separates it from faith, saying faith can be about past events or even bad things, but hope is always about a future good for the person hoping. But he also emphasizes the connection between faith, hope, and love, arguing that love is the base, the foundation that guides both faith and hope.
So hope for Augustine is about a loving relationship with God and looking forward to the future blessings that come with faith. And it sounds like this theological understanding of hope also affected his views on society and politics.
It did. In his famous City of God, Augustine talks about the earthly city, driven by earthly desires, and contrasts it with the heavenly city, defined by hope in God and eternal salvation. This heavenly hope becomes super important for understanding politics from a Christian perspective. It changes the ultimate goals of human society. For example, Augustine said hope should shape how we think about punishment, focusing not just on revenge, but on the potential for the person who did wrong to reform and find salvation. He even suggested that the hope for eternal happiness is what underlies true human flourishing, both for individuals and for the state. This influences the kind of political order leaders should strive for, one that doesn't get in the way of this ultimate hope.
So hope wasn't just a personal, spiritual thing for Augustine. It had real implications for how society should work. Then we come to Aquinas, who, as you know, brought together Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. How did he fit hope into all of this?
Aquinas, in his Summa Theolandrae, gave a really systematic and detailed discussion of hope. He distinguished between ordinary hope, which is our natural tendency to hope for earthly things that are hard but possible to get, and theological hope, a supernatural virtue specifically about being united with God and achieving eternal happiness. They're different in what they aim for, but Aquinas said they have similar structures. Both involve your will moving towards a future good that seems achievable even if it's difficult.
What did Aquinas think about the rationality of hope, both ordinary and theological?
He had a nuanced view. He recognized that not understanding something properly or lacking experience could lead to irrational or excessive ordinary hope, but he also saw ordinary hope as key for motivating rational action. By focusing on a desired future good that you believe is possible, even if it's challenging, hope pushes you to act in ways that might achieve it, guided by reason and understanding. However, because ordinary hope is about limited earthly things and can go too far, Aquinas didn't consider it a virtue in itself. Theological hope, on the other hand, being a gift from God and aimed at God, is inherently virtuous.
So theological hope is different, something given to you, not a natural inclination.
Exactly. For Aquinas, you need faith first, which gives you the belief in God and the possibility of salvation. Then, theological hope for eternal life becomes not only rational but essential for your spiritual journey. Unlike a lot of modern discussions, Aquinas saw theological hope as compatible with a good deal of confidence in achieving its goal, even though it's not absolute knowledge. And, importantly, despair, which means the complete lack of hope or turning away from the desire for salvation, that was considered a serious sin. Hope is about the future, so it's especially important for those of us still on our earthly journey, uncertain of our final destination. But love, directed towards the good itself, can stick around even after our final fate is revealed.
So the Christian tradition, from early figures to the medieval period, really changed how we see hope. It went from a potentially bad emotion to a central virtue tied to faith, love, and our ultimate destiny. A big change from some of the ancient Greek views. Now the outline takes us to early modern philosophy, the 17th and 18th centuries.
Right. And here we see a shift away from Aquinas' distinctions between ordinary and theological hope. Philosophers in this period went for a more unified understanding of emotions and desires as passions that drive us to act. Hope was usually seen as one of these passions. Importantly, many thinkers in this era started to move towards what we now call the standard account of hope, the idea that it's based on uncertainty combined with the desirability of what we're hoping for.
So back to those core ideas we started with, but maybe with more focus on hope as a motivator for action.
In a way, yes, but with their own twists. Descartes, for example, saw hope as a weaker form of confidence, wanting something good and possible that you think is likely, but not guaranteed. He also recognized that hope and anxiety are closely linked. Hobbes had a similar analysis, defining hope as pleasure of the mind, from appetite with an opinion of obtaining. He thought hope was the basis for courage and confidence, and he talked about its role in deliberation, how we weigh our hopes against our fears when deciding what to do. Interestingly, hope also played a big part in Hobbes's political philosophy. He argued that in a state of nature, everyone has an equal hope of getting what they want, and this is what ultimately makes them want to find peace and create a social contract.
So for Hobbes, hope wasn't just a personal feeling, it was crucial for understanding both individual psychology and the foundations of political order.
What about Spinoza? He had some pretty strong, sometimes unusual views on emotions, if I remember correctly. He did. Spinoza defined hope as a kind of pleasure or joy mixed with sadness, because you're not sure about the outcome. Unlike some who closely connect hope and desire, Spinoza separated the pleasure of hope from desire itself. He actually had a pretty negative view of hope, saying it's fundamentally irrational. He thought hope comes from the false belief that things in the world happen by chance, not because of strict necessity. He even connected hope to superstition, where people turn to supernatural explanations when their hopes and fears are strong. So Spinoza advocated for using reason and understanding to become less reliant on those up and down emotions of hope and fear and to achieve more peace of mind.
That's a pretty harsh take. But the outline mentioned that he still saw hope as important in politics, even though he thought it was irrational.
He did. Even though he saw it as irrational individually, Spinoza recognized how powerful hope and fear are in influencing people and how important they are in politics. He said rulers and laws use these emotions to keep things in order and make people obey. But he also said that a truly just and stable society should be based on reason, not on messing with people's hopes and fears. It's interesting. He suggested that in free and democratic societies, hope tends to be stronger than fear, reflecting a greater sense of agency and the potential for good things to happen. He even said that hope and fear are the very foundation of political power.
So even though he thought it was irrational, Spinoza understood how important hope is in shaping human actions and political systems. What about Hume, another key figure in the empiricist tradition? What was his perspective on hope?
Hume categorized hope as a direct passion, one that comes straight from your perceptions and ideas, specifically when you're thinking about things that could happen, things that are somewhere between definite and impossible, in other words, probable events. He said that when you think about a possible good thing happening in the future, your mind goes back and forth between imagining it happening, which makes you happy, and imagining it not happening, which makes you sad. If you tend more towards imagining it happening based on how likely you think it is, that's when you feel hope. So it's a mix of happy and sad, but happiness is the stronger feeling. For Hume, hope was basically an automatic response to thinking about uncertain but positive outcomes. You just feel it when you sense a chance of something good.
So in the 17th and 18th centuries, we see this idea of hope as a passion or emotion, often linked to uncertainty and desire. Thinkers like Hobbes and Spinoza also see how it plays out in the political world, even though they disagree about how rational it is. Then we come to Immanuel Kant, who, as we've seen before, brought a very distinct and influential perspective to philosophy.
Exactly. While earlier thinkers mostly saw hope as part of individual psychology, neither inherently rational nor irrational, Kant gave it a much more central and complex role. He connected hope to the very core of reason and our efforts to understand things that go beyond our direct experiences. He famously said that the question, "What may I hope?" is one of the three big questions of philosophy, along with "What can I know?" and "What should I do?" That's a huge step up for hope compared to how it was viewed before.
Making hope one of the main questions of philosophy really shows how important it is for Kant.
It really does. For Kant, this question about hope, especially as it relates to the ultimate consequences of acting morally and whether God exists, was both practical and theoretical, and he thought the answer ultimately lay in religion. So his take on hope is a bridge between his ideas about morality, which stress duty and reason, and his views on religious belief. He argued that we can't know for sure about certain things, like whether God exists or if the soul is immortal, but we have to believe these things to make sense of our moral experience, even if we can't prove them scientifically. And this belief then allows us to have rational hope for the highest good.
So, for Kant, hope isn't just a passive feeling. It's rooted in our rational, moral lives and tied to our deepest religious beliefs. What exactly were the things Kant thought we could rationally hope for?
He identified three main things. First, hope for your own happiness, but not just any happiness. He meant hoping for happiness that's in line with how morally good you are, as part of the highest good. He said this perfect balance isn't possible in the world as we know it, but we can rationally hope for it by assuming there's a highest reason, which we understand as God, who has the power and will to make this harmony between virtue and happiness a reality. Second, Kant talked about hoping for your own moral progress. He knew it's hard to be perfectly good, but he said it's our duty to try, and so we can reasonably hope to keep getting better morally, either through our own efforts or with God's help. And third, he emphasized the hope for moral progress for all of humanity, for a future with lasting peace and justice. This hope, he said, is grounded in a kind of assumption we make about the world, like a practical faith that things are moving in a purposeful direction, and this faith motivates us to work for a better world.
So Kant's understanding of hope is really intertwined with his ideas about ethics and religion, connecting it to our sense of duty, our struggle to be good, and our desire for a better future for everyone. The outline also mentioned a difference between how Kant described hope and how he thought we should use it.
Right, that's important. When Kant described hope, he often sounded like the standard account, saying it involves uncertainty and wanting or wishing for something. But his more important contribution is about how we should hope. He focused on the kind of hopes that are tied to our moral duties, arguing that we need certain kinds of hope to live in a way that's consistent with our moral beliefs. And he also tried to show that these morally grounded hopes weren't impossible, often by anchoring them in what he called transcendental assumptions, which are basically necessary beliefs that help us understand our moral experience, even if we can't prove them scientifically.
It sounds like Kant's view of hope, which is both complex and influential, has led to a lot of discussion and interpretation among philosophers.
Definitely. Recent scholarship has explored lots of aspects of Kantian hope, looking at it as something with an aesthetic structure, as a specific type of feeling, and even how it fits into his broader philosophical ideas. People have also used Kant's thinking about hope to address contemporary problems, like issues in the food system, ways to prevent people from becoming demoralized in tough situations, and the goals of practical education. Interestingly, the 20th century philosopher Walter Benjamin, who was very influenced by Kant, took Kant's ideas about hope and transformed them, shifting the focus from individual progress to a more collective and historical kind of hope, one that's concerned with redeeming past suffering.
So Kant's legacy on the philosophy of hope is huge, and people are still debating and learning from it. Our exploration continues into post-Kantian philosophy and existentialism, which, as we've discussed, often deals with the fundamental conditions of human existence and our limitations.
Right. In this period, there are two main ways of thinking about hope. On one side, you have thinkers like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Camus, who were very critical of hope. They were skeptical, sometimes even rejecting it completely, often seeing it as a sign of a flawed understanding of a world full of suffering and lacking inherent meaning. Then you have people like Kierkegaard and Marcel, who said hope is crucial for going beyond our ordinary experiences and finding meaning in a world that often seems absurd or broken.
Let's start with the critical perspectives. Schopenhauer, as I recall, had a rather pessimistic view of being human.
Very much so. While he acknowledged that it's natural for us to hope, Schopenhauer thought hope was a folly of the heart, and he really pushed for getting rid of it. He criticized hope for making our wishes and desires seem like they're probably going to happen, distorting how we think and stopping us from seeing the true nature of reality, which he believed was driven by a blind, insatiable will. He also said that while hope might give you brief moments of pleasure from anticipation, it always leads to disappointment when things don't work out, or even when they do, because the satisfaction is never as good or as lasting as we hoped. He even criticized Kant's idea of hoping for happiness in line with morality, saying it was just a sneaky way of focusing on happiness as the ultimate goal. Ultimately, Schopenhauer saw hope as something that prevents us from negating the will, which he thought was the only real way to reduce suffering. Although he did entertain the idea of an ultimate hope for the end of hope, which would mean being free from constantly wanting things.
So for Schopenhauer, hope is basically tricking yourself, keeping you stuck in a cycle of wanting things and inevitably suffering. What about Nietzsche? He also criticized many traditional beliefs. How did he view hope?
Nietzsche was famous for warning against what he called extraterrestrial hopes, which are hopes for a perfect afterlife or some future state of bliss. He thought these kinds of hopes distract us from living in the present. He even said hope was the worst of all evils, in his interpretation of the Pandora myth, because it prolongs suffering by making false promises of future relief. But Nietzsche's view wasn't just about rejecting hope completely. He suggested there might be good aspects of hope, like hoping to be free from their destructive cycle of revenge. He used a powerful metaphor, the rainbow, to describe hope. It's beautiful and alluring, promising something good, but ultimately it's just an illusion you can't reach. Nietzsche thought we should aim our hopes at more realistic and empowering goals, trusting in the potential for new philosophers and a radical change in values based on strength, creativity, and the will to overcome nihilism. But he also often warned that this kind of hope could easily turn into arrogance and self-deception.
So Nietzsche was against hopes that focus on escaping this world, but he saw potential in hopes that are more grounded in reality, directed at ourselves and creating new meaning. What about Camus? He talked a lot about the absurdity of human existence. Where did hope fit into that?
Camus' critique of hope is really connected to his idea of the absurd. He saw this conflict between our desire for meaning and the universe's indifference as fundamental and impossible to resolve. He totally rejected religious hope for an afterlife, saying it was just a way to avoid facing the absurdity of the present. He also criticized hoping for grand political or historical changes, saying they could lead to totalitarianism and sacrificing individual lives for a future utopia that might never happen. He used the myth of Sisyphus, the guy forever pushing a boulder up a hill, only to have it roll back down, to show how important it is to live without hope for ultimate meaning. He thought we should find joy and rebellion in the present moment, even in a meaningless world. But even Camus, while thinking about the human condition, admitted that it's really hard to live without any hope at all. He hinted at a kind of strange hope, a hope for embracing the present moment, finding solidarity with others in our shared absurdity, and creating our own values and meanings in a world that doesn't inherently have any.
So even though he saw life as ultimately meaningless, Camus found a kind of defiant hope in our shared humanity and choosing to focus on the present moment. Now let's move to Kierkegaard and Marcel, who had more positive views on hope.
Right. Kierkegaard, being deeply religious, mostly explored hope through its connection to faith. He said, true, Eternal hope goes beyond what we can understand and is the only real cure for despair, which he thought was the ultimate spiritual sickness. He defined hope as relating yourself to the possibility of good things happening, but he distinguished between earthly hopes, which often disappoint, and the radical, life-changing power of eternal hope. For him, that was Christian hope, focused on what's eternal and therefore impossible to be let down by. He even said that the disappointments we experience in life can serve a purpose. They show us that worldly things aren't enough and make us turn to that transcendent eternal hope, a hope against hope. He also emphasized the connection between hope and love, saying we can only truly hope for ourselves if we also hope for good things for others.
So for Kierkegaard, hope is all about faith and being willing to embrace possibilities that go beyond what we can fully grasp with our minds. And lastly, what about Gabriel Marcel?
Marcel made a distinction between saying, I hope, in an absolute way, which is a statement of trust and commitment, and saying, I hope that, which is about a specific thing you want to happen. He was mainly interested in the first kind, absolute hope, which he saw as actively overcoming despair and a fundamental way of being. He linked absolute hope to patience and a basic confidence that growth and meaning are possible even when we're suffering. He responded to the criticisms that hope is just wishful thinking by saying that absolute hope goes beyond specific things we imagine or expect. So if a particular event doesn't happen, it doesn't mean our hope was wrong. He used the example of someone who's sick. They might find hope not in a specific cure, but in realizing that life can still be valuable and meaningful even with physical limitations. Marcel was a religious existentialist, so he ultimately connected this absolute hope to faith in God. He saw it as a response of trust and openness to the ultimate source of being and goodness.
So in post-Kantian and existentialist thought, we see this really interesting range of views on hope, from totally rejecting it as a delusion to embracing it as a way to deal with the uncertainties and challenges of being human and our relationship with something bigger than ourselves. It really highlights the enduring and multi-layered nature of this concept. And now we move on to pragmatism, which is another interesting philosophical tradition.
Right. While hope might not always be the main focus in the writings of the classical pragmatists, many argue that a strong idea of hope is there in their core beliefs, especially their emphasis on meliorism, which is the belief that we can make the world better through our efforts. They also focus on the importance of faith, the potential for progress, and the idea that action and experience are key to shaping our beliefs and values. Thinkers like William James and John Dewey are particularly relevant here.
When I think about pragmatism, William James's will to believe comes to mind. How does that idea connect with hope?
James argued that in certain situations, especially when we don't have conclusive scientific evidence and our belief can actually help bring about the outcome we want, it's not just okay, but sometimes even rational to choose to believe. He explicitly linked this to hope when he criticized being overly skeptical, always trying to avoid being wrong. James asked why being afraid of being wrong should always be more important than the potential good that could come from embracing hope, especially when that hope can open up new possibilities and motivate us to act in ways that might make what we're hoping for actually happen. He famously said, "Why should we think it's more foolish to be tricked by hope than to be paralyzed by fear?"
So for James, hope could be a legitimate, even rational reason to believe in something, especially if that belief could create positive change. What about John Dewey? He was all about democracy and progress. How did he see hope?
For Dewey, the ideal of democracy itself was often a central object of hope. He thought creating a more just and equal society depended on people having shared hopes, values, and taking action together towards common goals. Pragmatists generally have a melior,